Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
Yo, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily Podcast. So excited to be back with my friends, Collin, Shameeka, my wife, Victoria. We are here on day 15 of our reading plan. Give yourself a hand. You've already read 10 days worth of reading, and it's so excited that you're here and we are at this point. We will wrap up Genesis this week, and so excited to do that. But just before we get into today's conversation, I had another Bible question for you guys. And just to get to know you a little bit, tell me, what is your favorite book of the Bible and why? I'm really curious.
Ooh. You want to start, Collin?
Yeah, I'll start. So I love the book of Acts.
That's mine.
I think mainly because we get to the place where Jesus has gone and left the people, and we see miracle signs and wonders still being done, but instead of through Jesus in a physical sense, it's through the people.
Yeah.
And it really shows that we have the agency and the ability to do the same things that we read in the Old Testament, the same things we saw in the life of Jesus. But now that power has been gifted to us to go and be the hands and feet of Jesus.
Good.
That's so good. Well, that's actually my favorite book of the Bible as well.
Okay.
I love the book of Acts because I just love seeing the early start of the church. I feel like it's a really good blueprint of what church looks like. And I really love seeing just like the progression and the growth and like the journeys that they took. And I think, Acts is just a beautiful book to me.
Yeah.
I like Acts too.
Ooh.
But that's not going to be my favorite.
Okay.
But it's on the same vein though. Because I like 1st and 2nd Kings. Because my boys, Elijah and Elisha, are in it. And they are my Old Testament versions of what the Holy Spirit can do through individuals. And so I love it how you guys got the New Testament version. I went back to the Old. And I get to see like some of the kings and all that stuff. So I love just watching the progression of the promise.
Good.
That's good.
Good. Yeah. I probably would say Philippians. It's brief, right? It's only, a few chapters there, but I just love, particularly Philippians chapter 4 is just my favorite chapter in the entire book. The entire Bible. And it's just this theme of joy and really in what's actually is a really crazy situation and circumstance for Paul to be writing it from prison. And so, I don't know, I think through a lot of tough situations in life, just kind of having that to fall back on is like, I can know how to, not to be anxious for anything. I can know to pray. I can know to still have joy. So yeah, I've just always been really encouraged by Philippians, but if I go top 5, Paul is probably in my entire top 5, but
for sure. There's so many good nuggets.
Yeah, there's some good ones. So okay, cool, awesome. Well, we're not in Acts, 1st, 2nd Kings, or Philippians today. We are finishing Genesis, and so we pick up here at chapter 36, and we've really just left off at Isaac. Excuse me, at Isaac and Rachel's death. Right, it's kind of where we've left off, and so. We're actually going to get into kind of the completion of this story through in 36 where we get Esau's lineage. We'll talk through that here. And then when we get to 37, as we go through 36, 37, and 38 today, 37 really kicks off the remainder of Genesis. All has to do with Joseph, who we'll talk about here in a sec. But let's not skip over this lineage, right? So we have 36 here with Esau. Anything that just jumped out to you guys as you went through his family, his family line and kind of what took place here in Esau's lineage. Anything that you guys found significant?
I know Victoria had pointed it out a few days ago, but just the fact that they highlighted that he married like women of Canaan, and how like Canaan was this place that you wasn't supposed to like go back to or just even marry the people there. And so that's something that definitely stuck out to me, is that, you know, he not only married, but he actually bore sons and children from women of Canaan.
And so after that, I love when it's like, and Ishmael's daughter, because then he goes
Yes.
back and marries Ishmael's daughter to please his parents. And so that's one of the things I highlighted here. Is like, okay, they're all right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the fact that God remembers Esau. Like, we know that Esau is kind of jacked up and does everything he wants to do. But the fact that he's still able to have a lineage and spread across the earth just shows that God's hand was still on him.
Yes. I mean, that's one thing I noticed is all these kings,
Yep.
all these chiefs.
Yep.
I was like, oh yeah, like the Lord really, you say, kept his promise that he was still going to be like with him in some type of way.
Yeah. 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 I just wondered, as this is being chronicled and written, and as, you know, the people of Israel are reading this, you know, I do wonder if they get some type of understanding and maybe even just respect and admiration for some of the lands around them and some of the people around them, right? To know like, oh, okay, those are like my distant cousins, right? You know, to kind of know some of these people. But I think that as I was reading this, it's just, I do love, like, we're only really 2 generations from Abraham, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're only at his grandson at this point once we get to Esau. And from there, I mean, you can already tell whether it's Ishmael's lineage, Isaac's lineage, now, you know, Esau and Jacob's, like, there's these, you can already tell, man, he is already multiplying and filling the earth.
For sure.
Right? Like, oftentimes we think about, you know, Jesus and, you know, all the generations thereafter that would come from Abraham. But I'm like, you don't even have to go but 2. And you can already see that God is blessing his lineage and those that come from Abraham really kind of across it. And so I think this gives us an example of that as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you actually said that, because I oftentimes get lost when we talk about lineage and we go through the names. But I feel like what you said reminded me of, like, this is God showing himself and fulfilling the promise of, like, I'm going to give you, like, the nations and, like, all these descendants. And so that's probably why this lineage was brought up, because we're seeing, like, we're just in the 2nd generation, but how big their family has grown so far.
Yeah.
And I love that you mentioned that these are like cousins, because these are people that they eventually like are fighting against, right? Like later on, the Israelites are bucking heads with the Edomites, and so I think it's interesting because it also fulfills the blessing that was given over Esau, or not so much of a blessing, right? That his younger brother was going to rule him.
Oh yeah.
So you see that the Israelites are ruling them like later on.
Yeah.
Good. Anything else here in 36?
I think the last thing for me was in verses 6 and 7, where it says that Esau, he went to a land that was away from his brother Jacob, because their possessions were too great for them to live together. And so, and they couldn't support their livestock. And it reminded me of, one, Lot and Abraham, right? And how they had to separate. But 2, it was like, also, it's like, wow, they really were blessed financially too. That like, they couldn't even be near each other, that they had to separate because of how the Lord had blessed both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think it also, you know, we had talked about before how Esau forgives, you know, Jacob, right? And they come back together kind of briefly, and then Jacob kind of dips and like goes a separate way. But Isaac's death, it seems to bring them back together, right? Because they come to bury Isaac. But this implication is that they have to have lived around each other long enough to have outgrown that land, right? And to kind of go a separate way. So, you know, even one of the questions I asked as I read is like, oh, did they like actually move back in? So when he returned, you know, to help bury his father, did they end up staying in that place? Because up until the point of Isaac's death, my understanding was they were apart from one another, right? Because Jacob, it kind of ran. And so I thought that was just an interesting footnote that they had to be close enough somewhat to each other to have like outgrown that land, and to even just see how Isaac's death might have even brought them back together in some way. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, before we get to 37, thank you guys for your thoughts on this, because I do think we'll get to many other lineages throughout this, and I think you guys have offered great insight that helps us to not breeze through this, but to kind of slow down and see that there's things that we can take away from even what we read in these names and lineage. But 37 introduces us ultimately to kind of the main, I won't say character, it's not a story here, but it's a historical account, but the main person that we will pretty much be dealing with through the end of this book in Genesis. We get introduced to Joseph and his dreams, which ultimately leads to some trouble for him. But anything in this 37 that just jumped out to you, it's a lot happening here between his dreams and his relationship with his brothers, his relationship with his father, how that makes his brothers feel. I mean, there's a lot of things that kind of come from this, but I won't necessarily start in any particular place. Anything that just jumps out to you guys in 37 as we get introduced to Joseph.
For sure. I'm seeing this reoccurring theme, especially for Jacob, I would say, like a favoritism. The fact that he favored, Rachel over Leah, and Joseph is one of Rachel's sons. Like, he's carrying out that spirit, if you will, of favoritism, which we see like his brothers end up hating him. Yeah. And that's what Leah did. Yeah. Leah ended up hating, her sister because of this favoritism that Jacob was displaying. So definitely saw that in this text, and how like just the family is continuing this like cycle of like hatred to the point of like, wanting to kill someone, Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah, I was just going to add to the other thought, because it really starts back from Rebecca, because Rebecca had favorited Jacob, right, to start with, and obviously Isaac favored Esau. So, I mean, it's even before, him specifically. But, yeah, anything else in 37?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that that in verse 11 it says his brothers were jealous of him after telling them about the dreams that he had. Number one, it's like, maybe you shouldn't tell everybody your dreams. Yeah. But he told them, they got jealous. But I do love that, Jacob kept it in mind, right? Or Israel kept it in mind. And it proves what we had talked about last week. Like, Jacob is one who internalizes and holds on to things and ponders over things. So I feel like it's another indication of that character trait here.
I also was wondering, like, I wouldn't be happy to hear about that dream either. So yeah. I wondered why Joseph like felt comfortable enough to share this with his brothers, not thinking that like someone would at least get mad. So I thought that was interesting. Also thought it was interesting too that Jacob, and I know we're interchanging between Jacob and Israel, because at this point in the text they're calling him both depending on the situation, but how he low-key had had Joseph be the spy of all his brothers. It was like he like trusted him and wanted him to like give him back information in regards to his brothers, and so I just thought that was interesting how you saw that being played out.
I feel like he just set him up to be a snitch.
Yeah, for sure.
Honestly, I'm like, don't do that to your boy. You know they hate him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like what stuck out to me was like in verse 12, how his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and like when he sends Joseph, why doesn't Israel go himself, like to check up on his flocks? And then I started thinking back with Dinah and the Shechemites, and I'm like, the last time that he's in their region, he sees what's going on. Like his daughter gets raped, and he's battling between the rulers over the Shechemites and trying to establish rapport. And is there a level of fear connected with Israel not wanting to go and send in Joseph on his behalf?
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, I thought like even to the point of the dream, like one of the things I just reflect on is, I think Victoria, you just shared, right? Like, why share, don't share your dream with everybody or make you kind of question that. But I think that to me, from Joseph's perspective, right, there's a level of intimacy that you would hope that the people closest to you, like you can kind of share what you feel and what you're hearing from God. But I think it's two things that jump out to me. Is like, one, obviously, yes, not everybody wants to hear kind of what it is that is God is saying, and not everybody wants to, hear how you may be elevated or you may be going somewhere or God is doing something with you. That's not always something people receive well, right? Unfortunately. But two, I think it also just speaks to the problem that we have, and I think, Collin, you used this word a few weeks back, in a different conversation, but the problem we just have with submission, that like, I think we hear that and their issue is like, oh wait, I'm a what? Like, I gotta bow to you, like I don't want to. But I think we disregard that God has set up like hierarchy and authority, and these are things that are naturally in God's order, right? In God's will, there is order, there is submission, there is authority, and it's going to call all of us to submit to somebody, right? To submit to someone's authority. And I think the problem is we think we ought to submit to the people that we feel deserve our submission, right? And that we feel deserve that authority. And where there's conflict is where we feel God has given that authority to somebody that we don't think deserves it or has earned it. But the crazy thing is, the more we go through scripture, we've already seen this happen thus far, but the more we go through scripture, we will constantly see God equip and establish authority with those whom others have like deemed insignificant or incapable, or doesn't have the ability to do that, right? Like, again, whether you're talking about a King David, where you're talking about a Joseph, even we go back to Jacob, obviously, over Esau, like time and time again, God gives that authority to people that like everybody else would be like, nah, they don't deserve that. And I think we just see that here, and we see that tension. And I think, again, for me, a takeaway is, let me not disregard what God might be doing through somebody that I might not feel like they have the ability or the skills or the experience or the education or the whatever else that might fit my particular criteria. But let me not disregard what God might be doing through them when God elevates or gives them an opportunity, and just say, God, if you're working through it, I submit to you and your will, rather than me feeling like, no, you got to earn your stripes or you got to do it this way. And I think that was just kind of something I took away from their response myself.
Yeah, that's good.
So ultimately they are upset with what he says, and they come up with a plan, right? So as Jacob sends him out to spy and to snitch, ultimately they see him coming and they come up with a plan, first to kill him, and then kind of go back and forth. Reuben tries to save his life, and some other things happen. But anything that in this whole story of how he ends up in Egypt, anything that was significant to you guys, really kind of maybe verses 12 through the end of the chapter here?
I think it was interesting that it was the Ishmaelites who picked him up. Now that we're like talking about lineages, right? Like, this is Ishmael and his descendants. I'm like, of course they'd be treating in Egypt because he went to go live near Egypt. His mother's from Egypt. Like, of course this is where they would be going to go trade at, right? And so it just kind of like brought things full circle for me.
Yeah, same.
And then they also just highlighted the fact that like Judah was the one who actually didn't want to kill him. It was like, let's sell him instead. Which in the next chapter I'm like, Judah. But
right.
In a few chapters later, when Jacob actually gives all these blessings, I'm like Judah got all these blessings, but he kind of messed up. But he actually did kind of save Joseph's life.
Yeah,
so
he did.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think, I love that you call that out, because we'll even get to that later this week in a couple different places, even when it came to the conversation with Benjamin, ultimately going back, that like Judah often established himself as like as the intermediary, right?
Yeah.
Like between like, okay, let's not kill him, like let's figure this out, right? Whether it was with Benjamin, like, here, I will be his protector. I make sure you can take my life, right? And these kind of things. And, you know, again, we're foreshadowing a little bit here, but like we know that Jesus comes from the lineage of Judah. And so you almost kind of see symbolically the way that, you know, he's putting himself in between these different places, whether it's between Joseph and death, whether it's between Benjamin, you know, that like he's constantly putting himself in that place and space. And I think it's very interesting to see that early on.
Yeah.
And I like how verse 21, when it talks about Joseph getting put in the cistern, and Reuben is actually the one who tries to save him. And I think, like, culturally speaking, like, Reuben was the firstborn, and Joseph is the one who really takes his life. Like, he is supposed to be the one favored by his father, being the firstborn, and in a sense being the one who has the dream and the favor with God, and he doesn't have that. And he's like looking at Joseph, knowing that that's the life that I was supposed to live, and he still chooses to like go out of his way to save him. That was interesting.
Yeah.
Good. Anything else? Kind of here in 37. Okay. So Victoria kind of alluded to it. Judah, as much as he did right in 37 and 38, we kind of have a relapse here, or just kind of a low moment. Talk to me a little bit about Judah and the situation with Tamar, and interesting story to kind of insert in between Joseph being sent to Egypt and then ultimately Joseph in Potiphar's home, as we'll get to tomorrow. Kind of an interesting story to drop here in 38. But what'd you guys find? What'd you observe really here in 38?
Kind of like how Shameeka was talking about in the chapter before about this theme of favoritism. I'm also starting to see this theme of manipulation.
Yeah.
And just knowing that Jesus comes from this line of Judah, just how everything in a sense had to be manipulated for this to happen. But even through man's manipulation, like God has purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
I was wondering why they keep choosing Canaanite women.
Yeah.
So weird. They chose a Canaanite woman, and I wonder if like that was the reason why his sons kept being so evil, and the God kept putting them to death. Also, like verse 9 is like the first indication of like birth control in a way, like where he was just like, nah, I'm gonna get some, but I'm not gonna let it happen. So I think it's interesting that the Lord thought how wicked he thought of this like act was to image, which in our culture is just so common, right? Like it's so common, and so I think it's interesting that he was put to death over it, right?
Yeah, I think for me, like, I've kind of a little bit struggled with seeing how people will do stuff that is like manipulative or like wicked, and then somebody else will do something in return, and then God like judges that. So for example, like, I mean, the fact that he had Esau, or is it Judah? Yeah.
Judah.
The fact that Judah had him marry like his brother's wife for the purpose of having offspring, knowing that the offspring wouldn't be considered his. Like, it's almost like, okay, he's justified in kind of what he's doing, if you will, but then God's like, no. Like, I'm not letting anything get past me on either end. So I thought that was interesting for sure. But it also was alarming to see how quickly the Lord was like, okay, no, I already see the wickedness, like literally put them to death because of how wicked they were.
Well, I was say, I do think it's always important to kind of understand the context, because we don't have we haven't got to the laws yet that ultimately God establishes, but like culturally and traditionally, and even what we get written, like the reason this was so important is because like the lineage through your son was essentially how your name lived on, right? And so like Judah's not trying to set up his son here. Like, he's saying, look, somebody has to carry our other son's name alone, and like this is common practice for us to say, well, let's have a child we pass them on, whatever, and that keeps that that son's name living on. And so it was more like, I don't even think that what he asked of him was necessarily, out of context or out of pocket. I think it's just that it was the rebellion and the selfishness of it that became the issue, that like, I'm not doing that for him, right? I'm not doing that, like that as the bigger issue in this particular case. But like I said, just like we talked about the kind of child sacrifice piece and how like in that time, like this is just kind of a common practice among a lot of the religions. Like what he asked, that was very much common. That was expected almost, that if your son died before being able to give birth to a son, that if you had another child or another son that could keep the name going and the lineage going, like that is the goal there. So, I thought it was, I've always kind of heard this text talked about a few different ways, right? Like there are some that will kind of bring out the birth control conversation specifically, and it might be a little loose interpretation of that, but obviously the biggest issue is the rebellion, right? It's the selfishness that God ultimately says like, no, that's unacceptable. And that's what ultimately, but I think, and the last thing I'll say on this is, we do see a few examples of God's just like justice. Excuse me. You think about, obviously we have Sodom and Gomorrah. We have some others, like we have obviously the flood. This is another one where it's just kind of like God's like, no. But I think, to me, it's always a misnomer and a misunderstanding of God to think that like he has this short temper and this short fuse, because as we just discussed, there's constant examples of his mercy, right? Where like somebody does something crazy and they continue to get blessed through it, or whatever the case may be, something happens. I mean, even as we continue the story, Judah wilds out, right? In the way that like he ends up sleeping with Tamar, who's a prostitute, or looking like a prostitute, and then ultimately sets him up. And again, Judah's the line of Jesus, right? So it's not like every time somebody sins, God was like, this is it. But we do see some examples every now and then where God is like, no, that's enough is enough. And I think that's what we see here.
Yeah, and I think like whenever those things are pointed out, I'm like, whoa, like God must have foresaw something that would have been super like detrimental for it to, for it. So that's what I meant by like alarming, because I'm like, oh, like that means like, okay, this wouldn't have been good had they lived on. Because
he could have just said no. Right? He could have just told Judah, like, I'm not doing that. But what he was doing was in secret, and probably only God saw or knew.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
So there's no way to out him, right? Like, there's no way to, so I think this was a way, just like you said, stop that wickedness, or stop, say, even that implant of seed into the next generation, like, of wickedness.
Yeah, and I think, like, the thing to understand, that this isn't just a slap in the face to Judah, it's a slap in the face to God. Because like for Onan to do this, like what he's saying is that I don't want to continue the lineage. And we understand now, like reading the entire Bible, how important Genesis 38 is, because if the authority would have stayed with Onan and he would have never provided any more seed, then we don't have Jesus. And so like we see from the beginning with the story of creation, that God has created fruit with seed in order to be fruitful and multiply. And anything that stops that, God has to remove so that his purpose can come alive.
Yeah, it's a good point. Because had that not happened, right, we don't get Tamar. Like Judah and Tamar specifically, right? Like that specific probably does not happen, because as you mentioned, this is done in secret, and it just keeps going on.
Yeah.
But anything about, so specifically this, Tamar and her scheme that kind of gets, Judah to conceive here, like anything in that particular story that you guys thought was interesting?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that like, well, I understood why Judah, like it's almost like he felt like Tamar was cursed, because he's like, man, all of my sons are like dying, and she was the common denominator. And so I can understand like his fear and like not wanting her to be around, but it on her end, I can understand like how you've been waiting and anticipating this promise of like, hey, when my, youngest son is old enough, like I'll be able to like marry him and like continue the lineage in that way. And you're just waiting around and then it doesn't happen. I could see both sides of that and how discouraging that could be. And so definitely was a little bit of a scandalous situation where, and seeing how common it was for Judah just be in a town and thinking it was a prostitute to the point of like, oh, I'm actually about to like have sex with her and like use her services. I'm like, okay, like, so that's what we doing? Yeah.
Like, and I understand he was grieving, right? Like, his wife had just died. He's probably grieving. But, like you said, just to go into a town and just, but like you said, but then also you said on Tamar's part, like, she needed somebody to take care of her. Like, she can't be a widow in her father's house this whole time. Like, eventually her father's going to die off, and widow, she was a woman. She needed a man to take care of her, so she needed a son. Like, she needed that. And so I just see that, like, this desperation. But I think once again, to like even Collin's point, like the fact that like the Lord will use like, Canaanite women in this scandalous situation to still birth, like it should be comforting to be like, okay, Jesus' family line was messed up.
Yeah.
I have hope too.
Yes.
I have hope. Like, there is no picking the best fruit. There is no like, you have to come perfect. Like, this was messed up in so many different ways. And so it does kind of give hope. But then, like you said, this child, one of them named Perez. I think it was interesting that there was twins.
Yeah.
And it was twins? Yeah, it was twins, yeah. And that Perez was the one that Jesus was going to come after, and so
and seeing all their names in the lineage, because I feel like now that I'm seeing all these different lineages and stuff, like it's encouraged me to go back to Matthew and to know that like Judah's name was in there, Tamar, Perez, like all this, this family, despite like you said the messiness, like it's like, oh wow.
Yeah, and I also find it's two things that you just made me think of something, but I was going to start with is I also feel like I always thought it was messed up, like the way he kind of treated her when he first found out she was pregnant. Like I just was like, okay, hold up, bro. Like, you just slept with a prostitute. Like, how you gonna have her come around and like now all of a sudden? And so I just thought it was so. Now I understand that culturally, like again, it was different. Like there was a difference in when a man laid with a woman versus when a woman laid prior to her, being married and stuff. But like, it just still felt like such a double standard. And it was just like, especially kind of, in the year 2024 of our Lord, right? Like it seemed like a double standard then in that. And so I always thought it was messed up. But I did think it was an interesting note that he never laid with her intimately again, right? That he just knew that like it was never meant for him to have been with her. Like that wasn't his place and role in that regard, because he's his daughter, right? And so he still respected that. Like he didn't say, well, I messed up, so I might as well just keep messing up. Like we here now. But to say like, hey, that's still not my place. But the last thing I was going to add to that I think you made me think of is what's interesting is, Moses again composes what we have here and kind of brings this together. He's not alive yet, so he obviously wasn't living through this, but he's the one to bring the story. And I do think it's so interesting that, as you point out, Matthew does this lineage and goes through this, that again, in my opinion, this story is random. Like when you're reading it, just kind of you look at Joseph and you get to, go to East, he goes to Egypt and we're going to get back to Joseph tomorrow and kind of whatever. This story is kind of random. Like what happened here seems to be just, could have been a footnote in a lineage. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it didn't really have to be like, here's the whole thing that took place. Yeah. And it's just so interesting to me that they found it significant enough in that moment to, one, keep track of it, to eventually write it down, to compose it, when we're generations from Jesus. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, this was included way before we knew Jesus was coming from this line. Yeah. Right? And so, to me, it's so interesting seeing that, in my opinion, even back then, God is like authoring that story. Like he's writing it out. Like this is gonna matter. Y'all have no idea why. Y'all putting it here in the middle of Joseph's story. you have no idea why this is gonna matter, but this is gonna matter. Like what is happening here is gonna be important. And I just feel like that just jumped out to me how out of place it feels for this story to be written at this point.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts here at 38? All right. Hearts and minds clear.
Yeah.
We all good? Cool. Well, look, we appreciate you joining us again today. Come back and see us tomorrow for day 16. I look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take